You also face criticism because once you put yourself out there, all of a sudden people begin to take their shots. Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez. You've made many visits there. I remember, I guess in '09, I was trying to interview you, and you were actually shooting a movie, I believe, down there.
I was trying to shoot a movie on the Haitian Revolution. It was President Hugo Chavez who embraced the idea around the issues of Afro-descendants. And one of the things that we've been working on, others, my friend James Early from the Smithsonian and others, is creating this relationship between what has happened with Afro-descendants in the hemisphere. There are 150 million African descendants in the southern hemisphere. In this hemisphere, 90% of them live in poverty. And what's happening with these extraordinary moments in grassroots democracy and reimagining democracy all over the hemisphere is that there's a place for African descendants. Brazilians, 90 million people of African descent live in Brazil. Colombia, all these questions are happening about here. And it's been exciting to watch them as they interface with the dynamics that are changing in their country. Yeah, you're going to get criticized. But when Hugo Chavez said, look at my hair. My grandmother was African. You know what I'm saying? How can you want to talk to him and find out how can we find ways in which that direct experience translates into kind of changes that need to happen in your country, but also in the hemisphere as well.
And the reason I brought that up, because
this 2013 interview is between Roland Martin, then of TV One, and Danny Glover. And I introduced this piece in order to tell you that a lot of what Danny Glover is talking about is covering over what really happened or didn't happen. Yes, Danny Glover went down to Venezuela a number of times. The earliest time, to my knowledge, is 2004. That could be not the first time. But in due course, in 2007, Danny Glover also received a massive payout from the Venezuelan government, which was originally to the tune of $17.8 million. And that is the subject of my latest piece from American Greatness, The Venezuelan Collusion of Danny Glover. And why do I highlight that? It is not about supporting any sort of intervention in any country, least of all Venezuela. I think that the message that I'm trying to put out here is that the Venezuelan government gave Glover tens of millions of dollars. Originally it was $17.8 million in 2007. In less than a year, they added $9 million. And it was supposedly in order to fund a movie that was a biopic, sort of an epic movie about the life of the Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture, who was a slave originally and led a massive slave rebellion. He's the father of modern Haiti. And that is the story that Danny Glover wanted people to believe. He wanted people like Roland Martin to believe that he was down in Venezuela in order to organize the production of this film. But by the time this interview was conducted, it had already been about 5 years. And yes, we do know that some movies go through what's called development hell, and that despite the best intentions of people, do any of you remember that Francis Ford Coppola, when he produced and directed Apocalypse Now, there was a behind-the-scenes movie that was documenting his mental state at the time, and it included a lot of rants and kind of funny, although disturbing, conversations he had with his wife. That is, it's not as if it's impossible to believe that Danny Glover ran into some complications on the way to producing the movie. But the fact is that there's no evidence whatsoever that the movie was produced, that a script was written by any screenwriter. There's no evidence that casting was conducted. There's no evidence of any of that. And we have no clue whatever happened to this money that Hugo Chavez gave to Danny Glover so generously. And I'm not going to pretend that this was a sum that Venezuela at the time was really desperate for. In 2007 and 2008, people have to remember, that was during the big oil boom. This was at the height of the Iraq War and the financial crisis. And I believe at one point the oil prices were at over $130 a barrel. And yeah, Venezuela was living high on the hog, and it looked like Hugo Chavez was actually going to lead, I guess, one of the more successful governments in the world. Obviously, in retrospect, that was really dependent on the price of oil, which eventually the cycle turned over, and there was the oil glut of the mid 2010s, the decade that's just ended, where you saw the price of oil plummet around 2013 and 14, and Venezuela ended up going through a massive recession. So I'm not trying to say that Venezuela giving him that money was either illegal. I'm not trying to say, not illegal on their part. I'm not trying to say that he was wrong in seeking funding from the Venezuelan government, because the fact is that, and this is a condensed piece compared to a different one that I prepared that might get published at a different time. The fact of the matter is that countries do fund films in order to promote their vision abroad. And I think that regardless of the fact that I don't like the Venezuelan government, I think that they're basically a bunch of tyrants, and they've stomped over one of the more fortunate countries in the world. They've rendering it a country of street urchins. Urchins. It's a new word, urchins. Yes, they're a nation of street urchins now. There's people. Venezuela was once the gem of Latin America, and now they're beggars, thanks to the Chavez government. But I'm not trying to say that him accepting the money is any sort of justification for, some sort of neoconservative policy. It does mean, though, that Danny Glover, okay, and I go through a lot of his ties over here. Danny Glover, who sits on the boards of several organizations. He's a goodwill ambassador for UNICEF. He has also been on the boards of organizations. You saw my expose if you follow this channel of the Real News Network a few weeks ago. He was on the board of that. He still is, probably. He was on the advisory board of Telesur English, which is a TV network that is co-owned by the Venezuelan government and the governments of a few other countries in South America and Latin America. He also was in contact with the Venezuela Information Office, which used to be registered and operating in Washington, D.C. as a direct lobbyist and registered foreign agent in Washington, D.C., lobbying our members of Congress. And his associates, Bill Fletcher and James Early, and he even mentions James Early in that interview, were contacted multiple times by the Venezuela Information Office in order to coordinate certain events and appearances and probably statements to the press. So this notion that Danny Glover is merely a person who is interested in Venezuela as a means of furthering the cultural heritage of African descendants in the New World is not an honest take on it. He accepted a lot of money in order to produce this movie, and he specifically talked about it a number of times, as late as 2015, in fact. And I will, let me see here. Right, so yeah, in 2017, he actually said, he still wants to make it. It says, when I spoke to, this is from Shadow and Act, this is a movie industry blog. It says, when I spoke to Danny Glover about his long in development Toussaint Louverture film in late 2011, this is what he had to say. We're still working on it. We're in one of those periods where the idea is still alive and still resonates out there. We just have to get all the resources together to make it happen. And I believe it's still a signature piece of our company and piece we want most to happen. And when I asked about the challenges he must have been facing in trying to get a film on the subject matter, finance, and produce, he laughed and added, "You don't want to hear those stories, man. The stories I could write a book on. Just in the process of trying to make a film about the Haitian Revolution, but the project is still alive." And then he goes and says, of course, we're now all familiar with Philippe Niang's French-produced, made-for-TV two-part movie on Toussaint Louverture that premiered right around the same time I had the above conversation with Glover, and which starred Jimmy Jean-Louis as the title character, as well as Aissa Maiga as Toussaint's wife, Suzanne. Okay, so anyway, this is, I believe, a cover. Okay, there's no reason that he could not have produced this movie. And it says, and despite all the setbacks, Glover still seemed determined to get the film made. When asked why the project was so important to him, he said, "Imagine a revolt where all those people who were enslaved and dispossessed in Africa, America, and around the world heard what had happened. You imagine what that meant to them?" So I would say that most people didn't hear about it because there was no internet at the time, and there was no broadcast TV, and there was no radio. So I would assume that only in some parts of the African world did people hear, and only in some parts of the world at large. I'm pretty sure that people in India were not really informed of what was happening in Haiti, with all due respect. So this guy was saying that was 3 years ago. I've been keeping tabs on the project since then, on the alert for anything that would tell us whether it's alive or buried for good. And today I learned of an interview Glover gave to Filmmaker magazine just earlier this year, in which he was, of course, asked about his long in development Toussaint project. And this is what he had to say when probed about what kind of movies he most wants to see in the world. And I quote, "The film that we always missed is a movie on the Haitian Revolution and Toussaint Louverture. The company is fortuitously named after him." He's talking about his own company, because Danny Glover owns a company called Louverture Films. Okay, let me see here. Yep. So these are all of the different films that they've produced, and they're films that actually do well because I would say they're kind of art house film festival movies. This one, Uncle Boonmi, who can recall his past lives, is, I believe, from Thailand. So they don't do well in the box office, but for whatever reason, and this is what's really important, okay? For whatever reason, Danny Glover is able to attain funding for a lot of small films that make almost no money, but he has a massive amount of money that he has on hand for a movie that he really wants to make, that was the one that he was always talking about, and he still doesn't make it. So that is what I am calling to question. This isn't about the Venezuelan government necessarily being at fault here, right? Because it's possible that Danny Glover took the money and spent it. Okay, it could be that he invested the money and it went bust, or that they tried to produce what they, there's all sorts of things that could have happened, but there's no evidence anything did happen. That is why I am saying that this is likely some sort of cover for what he's really doing, which is that he is a patron of a lot of these major, they're not major, they're actually quite small organizations that are promoting the Venezuelan point of view here in the United States. One could call them lobbyists. Okay, and that is what this story is about. He added, when the interviewer asked later in the interview whether he'd both direct and star in the project, and he said, "We started out with me directing, but the film for me is an important film. So if I'm not able to direct it, I would like to find somebody else who is able to direct it. There are several directors I have in mind who'd be interested in the possibility. I think Steve McQueen's 12 Years a Slave just opened up the possibility of another space for filmmaking. And that was the extent of the conversation on the project. Obviously, it's not dead, and he's still hopeful that it will get made, at least as of that interview, which was published in January of this year, meaning 2017. That's the most recent item I could find in which he talks about the film, but it doesn't appear to be a sure thing either, though he seems to be committed to seeing it come to fruition eventually. Longtime readers of this blog may remember Med Hondo, the Mauritanian director, producer, screenwriter, and actor, who claims that Glover's Toussaint Louverture project is in fact based on his own original screenplay. It was in 2010 when we reported on the damning open letter to Glover that Hondo penned expressing his concerns. As a recap, the intriguing short version of the story goes, Hondo said he'd been working on a biopic of Toussaint Louverture when he first met Danny Glover in 1991. Glover, taken by the project, made it known to Hondo that he would like to play the role of the Haitian revolutionary in, presumably, Hondo's film. Hondo claims that Glover then paid for an English translation of Hondo's script before disappearing with it, allegedly cutting off all communication with Hondo and his co-writer Claude Veillot. And thus, as Hondo insists, the film Glover has been trying to make for about 3 decades now is his own original screenplay. No word on whether that concern has been resolved on either side and what that could mean for any Danny Glover Toussaint film in the future. So that we have to throw in here a different issue that could have happened, which is sort of, tangential to any political concern, which is perhaps that Danny Glover has plagiarized, not even plagiarized, he's stolen the script of somebody else after paying for a translation of this. Also worth noting, Eugene Palsy told us in an interview in May of this year that she has also long been working on a Toussaint film. In fact, as she said 2 months ago, she and Glover were actually working on the same Toussaint film initially, but due to some differences, which she didn't elaborate on, they split and she went on to develop her own Toussaint project. Here's what she said specifically. I've had that project for more than 20 years. It was very difficult to get people to finance it because it's in Haiti and it's about Toussaint Louverture. So people did not want to be a part of it. So, same thing when I wanted to make my movie about South Africa. No one wanted to touch it. And finally I was able to get it made with MGM. Danny Glover and I had the same project. In fact, we were partners. Things didn't work out well between us, so I left with my project. He still wanted to make the movie, so he went his way and I went my way. I never gave up on it because I truly believe Toussaint Louverture is a very important character in world history. People don't know about him, and they have to know about that man because he was a humanist, a great leader. And then it goes into Philippe Niang's film. So people are speculating on whether he worked on this or not. And apparently there is at least one person who said that she did work with Danny Glover on producing the movie. But that one person does not actually give any, let me see this one. So, yeah, this is a broken link, in fact. But what I would like to say is this, okay? We have no evidence that Danny Glover has done anything in order to produce the film. Now, if he ripped off somebody else's script, then he already had something ready to go that he could edit if he needed to. And yet we don't have any evidence first. So he wouldn't need to have the script written. He likely would be way ahead, right? Now there's obviously problems when you get a script and then you have to figure out a way to adapt it and find a director that would be willing to, work using the script. But there has to be some sort of accountability here when you have tens of millions of dollars from a foreign government going into this investment and you just don't see any results. And what I was getting at earlier is that around the time that he received this funding, he also opened Louverture Films. And the partner of Mr. Mr. Glover is this woman's, this woman too, but Susan Rockefeller, who is the wife of David Rockefeller Jr. So this woman is, the wife of one of the most wealthy families in New York and in America, and they have massive nonprofits that control endowments of hundreds of millions of dollars. So yes, I would say that it's conceivable that he would have access to other capital in order to supplement the massive amount of money that he already had from the Venezuelan government. The other organization that he's partnered with is the Bertha Foundation. And Bertha Foundation, which I didn't go into too much in the article, but long story short, it was founded by a guy named Tony Tabatsnik, who is a South African billionaire, a pharmaceutical billionaire. He is known mainly in left-wing circles. He's a very pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist Jew. His politics are very similar to Danny Glover's. And regardless of that, regardless of what you think about any of these people's politics, the capital is there between Tony Tabatsnik and the Bertha Foundation, between them and Susan Rockefeller and the Venezuelan government. Danny Glover should probably have no problem finding funding for the movie. And I say this for a very simple reason, that he claimed that the reason that he couldn't get funding for the movie was because there were no white heroes in it. Okay, that was his excuse. So Glover said in July 2008 that the film was not attracting producer funding because it had no white heroes. So in July 2008, only a few months after this first tranche of payments was made to him by the Venezuelan government, he's already complaining that he can't get funding because of no white heroes. Right? So actually, yeah, I think the first tranche was in 2008, not in 2007. My mistake. So there was one installment of $17.8 million in 2008, and then $9 million more in 2009. And this is also significant because around this time, yes, the Real News Network gets funded. You also have, or founded, and then you have other organizations like the Center for Economic Policy Research. That is another organization that is very pro-Venezuela, on which Glover serves as a board member. So this was an organization. It still exists. Its co-director is Mike Weisbrot, who wrote an op-ed for The Guardian in 2013 saying, "Sorry, Venezuela haters, this economy is not the Greece of Latin America." And the truth is that, it's not Greece, because it's much worse. Venezuela at this point has sold the vast majority of its gold reserves to other countries like Iran. They're broke. They're giving away their gold in exchange for oil. It's inexcusable at this point to claim that Venezuela is a successful model for anything. And I don't think that even Mike Weisbrot, as of today, would say that. I would say, now, of course, what he would say is, there's been sanctions and an economic war. But you don't often see governments basically crumbling into nothing simply because the United States won't trade with them. Another thing that I want to note is that Glover literally took hundreds of thousands of dollars from a PR firm in order to lobby on behalf of the Ecuadorian government, and along with Mia Farrow in 2013, I believe it was. And at that time, Ecuador was a major ally of Venezuela. They had their president at the time was Rafael Correa, who was essentially the same philosophy as Chavez. He also signed a letter in 2017 condemning the new Argentinian president, Mauricio Macri. Macri's predecessor, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, who is now the vice president after she was term limited. So she's come back into power now, but she had been a major ally of Chavez and the Venezuelan government. And then he also contributed articles to the Institute for Policy Studies, which includes James Early as a board member. So James Early, just to be clear, is an academic. He works at the Smithsonian Institute here in the U.S. He works in Washington, D.C. And he even, he's on the board of the Real News as well. And this guy, who is a supporter of the Cuban Five, a group of Florida men who were arrested in 1998, who admitted to spying for the Castro government against Cuban exiles, this is one of Danny Glover's point men in these organizations. The other person, of course, is Bill Fletcher. Bill Fletcher, for those of you that don't know, is a person who has hosted Danny Glover for his show on Telesur. So I'll show you that. Yeah, this is him hosting both Danny Glover and James Early.
Today on The Global African, we've got a great treat. We'll talk with Danny Glover and James Early about the election outcomes in Venezuela. Then we'll give an update on what's going on in the Western Sahara. That's Today on The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us. On December 6th, there was a political earthquake that was felt throughout the Western Hemisphere. The Venezuelan elections led to a decisive defeat of the government party and coalition by an opposition that, ever since the emergence of Hugo Chavez and his movement, has attempted to reverse every reform that has been introduced by the Bolivarian government. Today we're going to explore what happened. We're going to look at the issue of Venezuela, and we're going to look at the question of the impact or potential impact that this election has on African descendants, not simply in Venezuela, but in the Western Hemisphere, because it is the Bolivarian government of Venezuela that increasingly has raised or called attention to issues facing African descendants in the Western Hemisphere. We're joined for this segment by Danny Glover and James Early. Danny Glover, of course, is a great U.S. film actor, director, and activist. He's also the co-founder and CEO of Lovature Films. James Early is a scholar and member of the board of the Institute for Policy Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to The Global African.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I want to start this with an analysis of the Venezuelan elections. Virtually everybody was predicting that the opposition was going to do well. The question was, by how much? And I wondered if the two of you were surprised by the extent of the opposition victory, and what do you make of it?
I am surprised by the extent of the victory in terms of the two-thirds supermajority that they now have in the House and the political implications of what they can do with that. Underneath that, however, in terms of the day-to-day politics, it was a lot closer in terms of the differences of why people voted. Many people voted not for the opposition, but against the government. Many of those
They wanted to punish the government.
Well, I wouldn't even say they want to punish the government. Mm-hmm. These are people, many of them, who've been pulled out of poverty, and now they want to have services. They have been set up over the last 16 years by.
So you can see that this is what they call pulling you out of poverty. So, this is still a shanty town.
What Hugo Chavez started out of dire poverty, out of lack of participation, to become an active citizenry, and had great expectations that now they could improve the quality of their lives. The failure of the government to deal with inflation, the currency exchange, things of that sort was frustrating. And so it was not punishment. It was saying, we want politics to be practical. We can't eat ideology. So it's unclear in this 20-party united front of the opposition of to what extent they're going to be able to wield a unified politic. And it may open up different kinds of coalitions around different kinds of policies in line with the left government. So it's going to be a battle both on the ground and both in the National Assembly.
It's certainly has been a disappointment for all of us who remain supportive of the Bolivarian Revolution and the changes that we saw firsthand up front that were happening in Venezuela.
So in that one statement, Danny Glover is saying that he's supportive of the Bolivarian Revolution. The Bolivarian Revolution can only mean supporting the Chavez and now Maduro governments, because the rest of the Venezuelan parties don't subscribe to that rhetoric anymore. They're part of the, I guess you would call it, the counter-revolutionaries if you're one of these people. So yes, if you read through this article, you get a bit of the detail. I do have a limit how much I can publish within one article in terms of length. So those of you that are very interested in this, yes, this could have some legal implications, and I'm not sure what they are. It's, I've emailed some people, but the important thing to emphasize is that now Venezuela is drowning in debt. It is drowning in poverty. It is running out of currency reserves. It does experience a massive energy shortage, both in terms of fossil fuels and both in terms of its own power grid. And that's what I want to emphasize, not this question of intervention or no intervention, because in my opinion, intervention is not necessary at all. It's not what the Venezuelan people need. We don't need troops enforcing economic relief. That's not the way that I look at America's role in the hemisphere now. Even with this new approaching Cold War with China, which people are talking about day in and day out. I don't even say, because, by the way, people talk about Venezuela's relationships with Russia and Iran being malicious. But yeah, Venezuela has a major relationship with China. They're very much in debt to China. And those are important factors, but those aren't as important factors as the one where we see a country that has gutted its entire economy. You have economic and social ruin on a scale that I personally have not seen in a different country. Not to say that there aren't humanitarian crises that are worse. There's been ones in Haiti. But you're talking about a country that went from having a fairly stable economy back in the mid-90s, even if it wasn't a fair economy, right? Because there's obviously a reason that Chavez did get elected, because there were people that were dissatisfied, and you can't just excuse the people who came before him. But he still his policies did lead to the worst regression of development and of economic production in the history of a peacetime nation. So, yeah, I would say that if you read through this article, you do see that Danny Glover, he took that money. We have no clue what he did with it. That's taking advantage of a country that was more than willing to help him. And if it's not taking advantage of them, then the question is, were they using those monies in order to invest in certain activities over here I think in some cases they should have been registered as foreign agents, as in FARA, the same type of law that Mike Flynn got popped for. I think that that's entirely appropriate to question. I think that Danny Glover should have a lot of explaining to do. And this was published over the weekend. Just making a video about it now. I am going to upload this to Library and to BitChute, so make sure to follow me at both of those different sites. One second. And I will see you later. Please like, share, and subscribe. You can also subscribe to me on all those other forums, so BitChute, Library, Minds.com, Subscribe Star if you want to throw some money at me, and Gab. Talk to you later. Have a great Tuesday.